The setup and the humiliation. The hall glowed under the soft gold of the chandeliers, their light dancing across polished floors and tall crystal glasses. It was the kind of evening where the wealthy gathered, wearing clothes that cost more than most people earned in a month. The air carried the faint scent of expensive perfume, mixed with the aroma of roasted meat and fresh bread from the kitchen. Soft music from a hired quartet played in the corner, blending with the low hum of polite conversation. The maid moved quietly among the guests, her black and white uniform crisp, her hair neatly tied back. She carried a tray of drinks, careful not to let the glasses clink, keeping her eyes down so she wouldn't meet their stares. She had worked in this house for almost a year. The pay was enough to keep the lights on in her small apartment and to send a little money back to her family. She never complained, never asked for more, never gave anyone a reason to think she didn't belong in her role. But nights like this were always the hardest, when the laughter was too sharp, and the stares lasted a little too long. In the far corner of the room, a group of guests were watching her as she passed. One of them, a man in an expensive suit, leaned toward the others and whispered something. The group laughed. The kind of laughter that wasn't meant to be heard by the person they were mocking, but always was. She kept her head down, but she felt the heat rising to her cheeks. She tried to focus on the weight of the tray, the careful balance of each glass. Still, their voices carried. "I bet she's never touched a piano in her life," one man said with a smirk. "She probably thinks Middle C is a brand of soap," another added, drawing more laughter. Her steps slowed without meaning to, her heart beating faster. The piano, it sat just a few feet from the center of the room, its black surface shining under the light. It was one of the most beautiful things in the house, and for her, it was also a reminder of something she had once loved and lost. The host of the party approached her with a glass in hand, smiling politely but with eyes that were too curious. "You there?" he said lightly. "Our pianist hasn't arrived yet, and the room feels a little dull." He gestured toward the grand piano. "Why don't you play us something?" A few guests gasped softly. Some grinned as if they had been given a front-row seat to a cruel game. She froze, the tray in her hands suddenly feeling like it weighed 100 pounds. "I'm just here to serve," she said quietly, her voice almost swallowed by the music and chatter. But the man waved his hand, dismissing her protest. "Come now. Don't be shy, we could all use a laugh." The words sank in, and she felt something twist in her chest. A laugh. That's what they expected. Not music, not beauty, not skill, just a moment they could retell later. The mocking glances from the nearby guests were almost daring her to try. She could. Hear the whispers now? "This will be good. She'll probably just bang the keys. She doesn't look like she even knows what to do." Her fingers tingled, not from fear, but from something else, a memory. It had been years since she had sat at a piano, her father's old upright, the chipped ivory keys, the hours she had spent practicing until the neighbors complained. Those days had ended when the piano was sold to pay the bills, but the music had never left her, and now they were giving her the chance, even if they thought it was a joke. She looked at the piano, then back at the room. She saw the smirks, the half-hidden grins, the boredom on some faces, and she made a decision. Slowly, she set the tray down on a nearby table. The glasses rattled faintly, the only sound she made. Then she walked toward the piano, her shoes tapping lightly against the floor. Each step seemed to pull the attention of more guests. By the time she reached the bench, the entire room was watching. She didn't sit right away. She placed her hand gently on the polished surface, feeling the cool smoothness under her fingertips. Then, with quiet grace, she lowered herself onto the bench, her back straight, her hands resting lightly in her lap. From somewhere in the room, a voice called out, "Play us something cheerful." The group near the corner chuckled. She ignored them. Instead, she placed her fingers on the keys, feeling their weight, their familiar shape. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, blocking out the faces, the room, the cruel expectations. The world narrowed down to her and the piano. When she pressed the first key, the sound was soft but clear, a note that seemed to cut through every whisper. In that single moment, the game they had planned began to change. The first touch of the keys, The single note still floated in the air. Clear and pure, it was almost too small to notice at first, but it had a strange weight to it, as if it carried a memory. Some guests shifted in their chairs, expecting her to stumble right after, but she didn't move in panic. Instead, her fingers rested lightly on the keys, like someone greeting an old friend. Her eyes stayed closed, and she let her breathing fall into the same slow rhythm she had used as a child back then. She had been taught that the first sound mattered, that it set the heart of the song. Now she was letting that truth guide her. She pressed the next key, then another. The sounds blended into a gentle, almost hesitant melody. It was not flashy. It wasn't meant to impress in the way most performers tried. It was intimate, like a quiet voice telling a secret meant only for the listener. Somewhere in the back of the room, a man tilted his head, his earlier smirk fading. Others leaned forward slightly, their conversations softening. The maid's fingers began to move in patterns that flowed like water down a hill, slow, steady. With small bursts of lightness in between, she didn't look at the people, didn't care to see their expressions. Her world now was only the piano and the sounds it gave her. It had been years since she had touched such fine keys. The difference between the old upright from her childhood and this grand piano, it's like the difference between a dusty country road and a marble hall. Yet her hands adapted instantly, memory guiding them. Her left hand laid down soft chords. Her right hand danced over them with careful grace. It was as if each finger remembered exactly what to do. The notes began to bloom, filling the hall with warmth. The guests, who had expected clumsy banging on the keys, now found themselves listening to a melody that felt alive. It was slow at first, but it had a hidden strength. Every few bars, the rhythm would pause, just enough to make the listener lean in. Her touch had a way of making the piano sound like it was speaking, and in a way, it was telling her story. Without a single word, she could feel the change in the room without opening her eyes. The laughter had stopped. The cruel whispers had faded into silence. Even the clinking of glasses and the quiet shuffling of feet seemed to pause. All that existed was the music, and for the first time that night, she felt free. Her mind drifted. Not to the faces in front of her, but to her father's small apartment, to the nights, when she had stayed up long after the rest of the family had gone to sleep. She remembered running her fingers along the chipped ivory, playing until her arms ached. She remembered the sound of her father's cough from the bedroom, how she would play softer then so as not to wake him. And she remembered the day the piano left, strangers lifting it onto a truck, her father standing at the door with a look that said he wished there had been another way. Tonight, though, that loss felt far away, because the music was still hers. She let her hands move faster now. The melody began to rise, notes chasing each other like wind through autumn leaves. It wasn't something she had planned. She wasn't reading music. She was building it right there in the moment, letting her heart decide where each note would land. A guest in a dark blue dress leaned forward, lips parted slightly. A man, who had been halfway through a drink, set his glass down without realizing it. Even the hostess of the party, who had been speaking to someone near the door, turned fully toward the piano, her eyes fixed on the maid. It was no longer a game, no longer an attempt to humiliate. Something else was happening, something even the guests couldn't quite name yet. They had expected awkwardness, maybe a wrong note or two. Instead, they were hearing music that sounded like it belonged in a concert hall. And the strangest part was how natural she looked doing it. No tension in her shoulders, no stiffness in her hands. It was like the piano had been waiting for her. And she for it. The melody softened again. She brought it down to a near whisper. Her fingers barely grazing the keys, it made the room lean in further. Though afraid they might miss something if they moved, the pauses between the notes were deliberate. They made each next sound feel like a gift. And when she returned to the melody, it was with a subtle shift, a small spark of brightness that lifted the air in the hall. By now, she could feel it. The power had shifted. When she had first sat down, the room had been full of smug faces waiting to laugh. Now, they were quiet, attentive, and maybe even a little humbled. She didn't play for their approval, though. She played for herself. For the little girl who had once dreamed of filling her life with music, for the father who had sacrificed. So much for the years when her hands had only touched brooms and trays instead of keys. And for this moment, which was hers entirely, the last part of the melody for this section came softly. Her fingers slid down the final notes, letting them fade into the air. She didn't stop playing, but the room didn't know that yet. They thought the piece was ending, and they held their breath, waiting, wanting more. Dan, and she smiled to herself, because she knew this was only the beginning. The shift in the room, the air in the hall felt different now. When she had first been called to the piano, it had been thick with amusement, sharp with hidden cruelty. Now, it was as if every sound that wasn't the piano had been tucked away, leaving only her music to breathe in the space. The laughter had gone, the smirks had melted, and even the small rustle of dresses or the clink of silverware seemed to pause between her notes. The melody was changing. It was no longer the soft, hesitant stream it had been at the beginning. It was growing warmer, fuller, as though each note was pulling the guests further away from their world of champagne and small talk. Her left hand laid down a slow, steady rhythm, while her right hand danced above it, spilling out runs of bright sound, like sunlight breaking through clouds. Each chord seemed to lean into the next. There was no rush, yet there was a quiet urgency, as if the song was telling a story that had been waiting too long to be heard. The man who had mocked her earlier sat rigid in his seat now. His drink remained untouched on the table beside him for the first time that night. His eyes didn't look for someone else to join in a smirk. They were fixed on her hands, hands he had dismissed as clumsy, moving with precision and grace across the room. A woman in a silver gown had stopped fanning herself. She sat forward, one hand against her cheek, her expression softening with each passing measure. The maid didn't see any of it. She was somewhere else entirely. Her eyes were still closed. But behind her lids, she could see the little living room from her childhood, the second-hand couch, the faded curtains, the chipped upright piano in the corner. She could feel the worn seat under her, hear the soft ticking of the old wall clock as she practiced, and she could hear her father's voice from the kitchen, humming along without realizing it. Those days had been full of struggle, but also full of dreams, that same dream to play freely. To be heard was spilling out through her fingertips now. The music built in strength. Her hands moved faster, crossing over each other, the melody climbing higher. It wasn't just skill, it was emotion. The kind of emotion that made the listener feel something, even if they didn't know why. Some guests felt their chests tighten, some swallowed hard. Though they couldn't have explained the sudden lump in their throat, one older man quietly removed his glasses to wipe at his eyes before anyone noticed. Every so often, she would pause just for a fraction of a moment and let the silence hang. Those pauses were magic. They made the next note feel like a gift. The guests found themselves leaning forward without realizing it. It was as though the entire room had unconsciously agreed to move with her. Her music pulled them in, lifted them, and then set them down gently, only to take them somewhere else again. Even the staff had begun to gather near the edges of the room. A young waiter holding a tray had stopped completely, standing frozen as though a single step might break the spell. The hostess of the party, who had initially looked amused at the idea of the maid playing, now stood near the doorway with her arms crossed, but her face was not cold anymore. It was softer, almost proud. She watched not as a critic, but as someone who was seeing something rare. The wealthy guests, people who had traveled, dined in the finest restaurants, and heard the most expensive orchestras, were realizing that this moment was different. It wasn't a polished performance meant to impress. It was something raw and unfiltered. They were hearing someone pour their own life into the music. Without asking for anything in return, the piece began to swell toward another high point. Her left hand pressed deep, resonant chords while her right hand flew. The sound seemed to fill not just the hall, but every corner of their minds. Some guests closed their eyes, letting the music carry them. Others kept staring, unwilling to miss a single movement of her hands. It was not the sight of wealth, luxury, or power that held them. It was the sight of talent that could not be bought. And then came a shift. The melody slowed. It sank into something almost like a lullaby, warm and aching at the same time. Her fingers caressed the keys, each note falling gently as though afraid to disturb the air. It felt like the closing of a chapter, though none of them wanted it to end. In that softness, the room changed again. The distance between the maid and the guests, the invisible wall that had always stood between staff and owners, felt smaller. For a few breaths, they weren't separate worlds. They were simply people listening to something beautiful together. When she finally lifted her fingers from the keys, there was no instant applause, just a deep, charged silence. The guests sat still, almost startled by their own stillness. Then slowly, the sound of hands meeting filled the room, light at first, then swelling into a wave of applause that rolled over her. Some guests stood, clapping harder, their faces open with admiration. She kept her head low, her expression calm, but inside, she felt something shift, something that had nothing to do with their approval. She had not played to prove herself, she had played because she still could. Because no matter what uniform she wore, the music was still hers. And as the applause filled her ears, she knew the night was not over. It was only turning a page. Memories behind the music, as the last note faded into the warm air of the hall, her hands rested gently on the keys to the guests. She looked calm, as if she had simply played a tune she had known all her life. But inside, her heart was still racing, not from fear, but from the memories that had surged through her with every chord. The truth was, she hadn't just been playing a song, she had been reliving moments. The music had carried her back to a narrow apartment with peeling wallpaper. The smell of homemade soup on the stove, and the sound of her father coughing softly from the other room. It had been years ago, but the images were still sharp. Back then, they didn't have much, but they had the piano. It sat in the corner of their small living room, old and worn, but it was the brightest thing they owned. Her father had found it in a second-hand shop. It had a cracked leg, a few keys that stuck, and the finish had long since dulled. But to her, it had been magic. She was just a child then, her feet barely touching the floor when she sat on the bench. The first time she pressed a key, she felt something stir in her chest. It wasn't just sound, it was possibility. Her father had noticed that look in her eyes from then on. Every evening after his shift at the factory, he would sit with her, teaching her simple melodies. He didn't know much about music himself, but he believed she could learn. And he believed enough for the both of them. They couldn't afford lessons. So she learned from old library books. She traced the notes on the page with her finger. Matching them to the keys by trial and error, she played until her wrists ached. Her father never told her to stop. Sometimes he would fall asleep in the armchair beside her, the soft rhythm of his breathing blending with her music. Years passed like that, the piano becoming a part of their family. It was there for birthdays, for rainy afternoons, for evenings when the power went out and the only light came from a candle on top of it. It was there the day her father came home early, his face pale, his steps slow. That was the day she learned he was sick. From then on, the apartment felt heavier. The music was still there, but it had a sadness in it. She played for him every night as if the sound could hold him together a little longer. But medicine was expensive. Bills piled up faster than they could pay them. One morning, she came home from her shift at the diner and found two men lifting the piano onto a truck. Now her father stood in the doorway, his hands clenched. "They'll give us enough for the first round of treatment," he told her quietly. She had nodded, holding back tears. That was the last time she touched a piano for years. She took every job she could find, cleaning houses, serving tables, washing dishes. Music became something she carried only in her head. Sometimes she would hum softly to herself while scrubbing floors. Other times she would tap out invisible notes on the edge of a counter. It was never enough. She had thought that part of her life was gone forever until tonight, sitting at the grand piano in this glittering hall. Her fingers had found their way home without hesitation. The smooth ivory under her touch felt nothing like the chipped keys she had grown up with. But it didn't matter. The music was the same. Every note tonight had been for her father, for the little girl who had once dreamed for the years. When her hands had known only work, it was why the melody had flowed so easily. She wasn't performing for the people in the room. She was speaking to the ghosts of her own past. From where she sat, She could sense the silence of the guests. They didn't know the story behind the music. They didn't know about the nights she had practiced until her fingers cramped, or the day she had stood in the doorway watching her piano disappear down the street. But they could feel something in it, the truth that music is never just notes. It's the life poured into them. Her thoughts returned to the present as she let her hands rest in her lap. The applause had begun to rise again. But it sounded different now, warmer, more genuine. She lifted her head slightly, meeting the eyes of a few guests. Some looked at her with admiration, others with something. Almost like respect. It was strange. These were people who, an hour ago, might not have remembered her face by the end of the night. Now, it would remember her for the sound she had given them. She stood slowly, giving the piano one last look. In the crowd, she spotted a waiter she knew, standing still with his tray. Balanced on one hand, he gave her the smallest nod. It was enough. A quiet acknowledgement from someone who understood what it meant to work unseen. She stepped back from the bench, ready to disappear into the background again. But she knew something had changed, not in them, but in herself. The music she had thought was lost was still hers, and no matter how many floors she scrubbed or trays she carried, that would never change. The crowd transformed. The applause faded slowly, like waves retreating from the shore. But the quiet that followed didn't feel empty. It was full, alive with something unspoken. For a moment, no. One moved, as though shifting in their seats might break whatever had just happened. The maid stood beside the piano, her hands still tingling from the music. She glanced down at her uniform, the same black and white she had worn all night. Nothing about her appearance had changed. Yet the way the guests were looking at her made it feel as if she had stepped into a different skin. The woman in the silver gown, who had earlier whispered mocking words to her companion, now leaned toward the edge of her chair. Her eyes followed the maid with a softness that hadn't been there before. She clapped again, slower this time, not out of politeness, but with genuine appreciation. Others joined in, not the polite, distant applause of wealthy strangers, but the kind that comes from having been moved near the back of the room. The young waiter was still standing with his tray. The corners of his mouth lifted in a small, proud smile. He had worked enough of these parties to know how rare it was for the attention to leave the glittering guests and focus on someone like them. He nodded when her eyes met his, a quiet gesture that said more than words could. The man in the expensive suit who had first mocked her shifted uncomfortably. He cleared his throat and took a sip from his untouched drink, as if hoping to disappear behind the rim of the glass. But the people around him had noticed his earlier remarks. They glanced his way with raised brows, and for the first time that evening, he seemed unsure of himself. She didn't bask in their attention. She didn't bow or smile widely. Instead, she simply stepped back, her gaze lowered. There was dignity in her quietness, and that made it all the more powerful. The hostess moved forward from the doorway, her heels tapping lightly on the polished floor. She had expected the maid to refuse earlier, or to fumble through a few notes. Now she was studying her as if trying to place her in a new category entirely. A man in the front row, dressed in a deep navy coat, spoke up. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked. His voice carried genuine curiosity. She hesitated, her lips parting. But no answer came. It wasn't shyness, it was choice. She didn't want to unwrap her past here, in front of strangers who might see it as a story to tell over. Dessert instead, she simply said, "I used to play," and left it at that. It was enough to deepen the mystery. Several guests leaned toward one another, whispering in low tones. But the whispers were no longer cruel. They were full of wonder. Some even looked at her with the same interest they might give a guest of honor. It was an invisible shift, the moment when someone stops being the help and starts being someone worth knowing. She felt the change too. It wasn't the clapping or the softened gazes that stayed with her. It was the way they were listening now, truly listening, even though the music had stopped. They weren't waiting for her to make a mistake or to amuse them. They were waiting for what she might do next. The hostess spoke, her tone warmer than before. "You have a gift," she said, almost as if she were speaking to herself. Then she turned to the crowd. "Doesn't she?" The room responded with fresh applause. It rolled through the air again. This time without the stiffness of social obligation. It was lighter. Freer applause that came from hearts rather than habit. Somewhere in the crowd, a man with silver hair raised his hand. "I teach at the conservatory downtown," he said. "If you ever want to revisit the piano, we should talk." His words were gentle, an invitation rather than an order. The maid felt a flicker of something in her chest. Hope. Maybe. But she didn't let it show on her face. She only nodded politely for now. She wanted to hold this moment for herself before deciding what to do with it. The mood of the room had transformed completely. Gone was the idle chatter, the background gossip now. Conversations hummed with her name, her playing, her unexpected brilliance. Even those who had barely noticed her before were stealing glances. It wasn't just admiration, it was a quiet kind of respect, and that was rarer than applause. She moved toward the side of the room, intending to return to her work. But as she passed, people stopped her. A woman touched her arm lightly and said, "You made me think of my mother." "She used to play," another guest murmured. "I haven't heard music like that in years." It was strange all evening. She had been invisible now. She could not move 3 steps without someone speaking to her, and yet she didn't let the attention sweep her away. She knew how quickly rooms like this could turn, but she also knew something had shifted inside her, the wall she had built. Between her old life and her current one had cracked. Through it, the music had slipped back in. And no matter what tomorrow looked like, trays, dishes, mops, she had reminded herself that she was more than her uniform. The guests began to drift back to their conversations, but the atmosphere was not the same as before. The music still lingered in the corners. It had changed the night, and in a way it had changed her. The final note, the conversations had begun to stir again, but the sound was softer now, almost careful. It was as if the guests were reluctant to disturb the air that still carried the weight of her music. The maid stood by the side of the piano. Hands folded in front of her, she had thought the performance was over. But deep inside she felt something unfinished, a quiet tug, the kind an artist feels when a canvas needs one more stroke. Her eyes drifted back to the grand piano. It sat there like a silent invitation, its black surface catching the light from the chandeliers. She could almost hear it whispering to her, not with words, but with the memory of keys beneath her fingertips. Around her, the guests were still watching, though some tried to pretend. They weren't. The hostess tilted her head, sensing something in the maid's stillness. "Would you play again?" she asked, her tone more like a request than a command. The maid hesitated, not out of fear but because she wanted to choose the right piece. If she played again, it couldn't be just another song. It had to be a closing chapter. Something that would carry the night to a place no one expected. She stepped forward. Each movement quiet but deliberate. The room seemed to slow with her. Her shoes made the softest tap on the floor. When she reached the bench, she didn't sit immediately. Instead, she ran her fingers lightly over the closed lid before lifting it. The faint creak of the hinge seemed loud in the hush. Then she sat down. Her posture straight but unforced. This time she didn't close her eyes. She looked at the keys as if reacquainting herself with an old friend. The first note was deep. Resonant, the kind that doesn't just echo, but settles into the listener's chest. It was different from before. This melody carried weight. Her left hand moved slowly, laying down a foundation of low, rich tones. Her right hand added sparse, delicate notes that floated above them like drifting leaves. The contrast made the music feel both heavy and light, and already the room was leaning in. She wasn't trying to impress them anymore. She wasn't even thinking about them. She was speaking in the language she knew best, the one without words. The song grew slowly, unfolding like a story told by someone who knows you'll stay to hear the end. Every note was deliberate, every pause meaningful. There was no rush, only the steady, patient pull toward something inevitable. The guests had stilled again. Wine glasses remained untouched. The young waiter in the corner shifted the tray to one arm so he could listen more closely. The hostess clasped her hands together in front of her. Even the man who had mocked her at the start now sat with his eyes lowered as if unsure where to place himself. Her fingers began to travel higher up the keys. The melody brightened, not into cheer, but into something that felt like light breaking through clouds. It was hope, soft, cautious, but unmistakable. It wrapped itself around the deeper notes, weaving a pattern that lifted the weight from them. Some guests found themselves holding their breath without realizing it. Others felt an ache in their chest, the kind that comes when you're reminded of something you'd almost forgotten. Then, without warning, she pulled the music into a swell. It rose, strong and sure, her hands crossed. Her wrists moving with fluid precision, the notes tumbled, one over another, like waves rushing toward shore. It was no longer just a performance. It was release. All the years of silence, all the nights when her music had been trapped inside her, came pouring out. The grand piano seemed to respond in kind, its strings vibrating with everything she gave it. The swell reached its peak, and just when it felt as if it could climb no higher, she let it fall. The music softened, pulling back into something tender. Her right hand played a gentle phrase, repeating it with small variations each. Repetition felt like a heartbeat, steady, human, familiar. She let the phrase slow. The spaces between the notes widened, until finally there was only one note left to play. She pressed it lightly. It rang clear and sweet. And as it faded, she lifted her hands from the keys and let them rest in her lap. The sound was gone, but its echo hung in the air for a long moment. No one moved. It wasn't just the beauty of the last note. It was the way it carried the weight of everything that had come before. The applause, when it came, was softer than earlier, not because they were unimpressed, but because they were still caught in the spell. It built slowly, like dawn light filling a room. Soon the hall was filled with clapping, but it was different from before. It was gratitude, not just praise. The maid stood and gave the piano one last glance, her lips curved into the smallest of smiles, not for the guests, but for herself. She knew she had given them something they hadn't expected. But more importantly, she had given herself closure. It was the final note of a chapter she thought she'd never finish. Now she could walk away knowing the music was still hers. An unexpected offer. The applause softened, leaving behind a kind of charged quiet. The maid stepped back from the piano, her hands folding neatly in front of her once again. Her uniform still marked her as staff. Yet the looks she received now were entirely different from the ones she had felt at the beginning of the night. She could feel the weight of their eyes, not in judgment but in curiosity, maybe even admiration. She turned slightly, ready to slip away toward the kitchen. It was time to return to the work that had brought her here. But just as she began to move, the hostess stepped forward. Blocking her path, there was something new in the woman's expression, a softness, a kind of wonder that didn't fit with the polished control she had worn all night. That was... The hostess began, pausing as if searching for a word that could hold what she had heard. Extraordinary. The maid lowered her gaze politely, unsure how to respond. It was nothing, she murmured, though they both knew it wasn't true. Before the hostess could say more, a voice called out from the front row. It belonged to an older man with silver hair and a dark blue scarf draped loosely around his shoulders. He rose slowly from his seat, leaning on a polished cane. I know talent when I hear it, he said, his voice deep and sure. And what I heard tonight is rare. The guests turned toward him with interest. Many seemed to recognize him. There were murmurs, a few discreet nods. He stepped closer to the piano, his cane tapping lightly against the floor. I was the director of the city's music academy for 25 years, he said, his eyes fixed on the maid, and I can tell you, there are students who have trained their entire lives who couldn't play with the feeling you just showed. The maid's breath caught. She wasn't used to praise from strangers, especially not from people with titles and reputations. I don't have any training, she admitted softly. He smiled faintly. You have something better. You have truth in your playing. From another corner of the room, a younger woman in a deep green dress stepped forward. I manage performers for the winter gala, she said. Her tone was brisk but warm. If you ever want a stage, I could make that happen. The maid felt her heart thump harder in her chest. This wasn't why she had played. She hadn't come here for attention or for opportunity. She had sat down at the piano because she couldn't let them mock what she loved. But now doors she had never imagined were quietly opening in front of her. The hostess spoke again, this time with a note of excitement in her voice. "We could host an evening here, invite people who would truly appreciate what you can do." Her words sounded sincere, not like the empty politeness often found at parties around them. The other guests began to murmur ideas, names of concert halls, small salons, charity events. It was dizzying. An hour ago she had been invisible. Just another face in a uniform now. They were talking about her as if she belonged in the center of a stage. The maid shifted slightly, her instinct telling her to step back. She had spent years blending into the background. The idea of stepping forward into light, into notice, felt strange. But another part of her, a quieter, long-buried part, leaned toward it, not for fame. Not for the glitter of rooms like this, but for the chance to sit at a piano and let the music breathe. Again, the older man in the blue scarf seemed to sense her hesitation. "You don't have to decide now," he said gently. "Mott, no, this talent like yours doesn't disappear, no matter how many years pass without it being heard." His words struck something deep in her. She thought of the years she had worked in silence, the nights she had hummed to herself while scrubbing floors, the invisible music she had carried all this time. Maybe he was right. Maybe it had been waiting, not gone. The hostess gestured toward one of the waiters, who hurried over with a small silver tray. On it were several business cards from the man, from the woman in green, from others whose names she didn't know. The maid stared at them for a moment. The small rectangles of paper holding promises she had never thought to receive. She hesitated before taking them, slipping them into the pocket of her uniform. They were light in weight, but heavy in meaning. The attention slowly shifted back to the rest of the evening. Guests began to speak to one another again, the clinking of glasses resuming, but the air still felt changed every so often. Someone would glance her way, not as the maid bringing drinks, but as the woman who had just silenced an entire room with music. She didn't rush back to the kitchen right away. Instead, she lingered by the piano for a few more breaths. Her fingers hovered above the keys one last time, not to play, but to feel the cool smoothness. She knew she might never see this room again. But she also knew that tonight had planted something in her, something that could grow if she let it. And as she finally turned and began to walk toward the kitchen, she carried with her not just the memory of the music, but the knowledge that she had been seen, truly seen, and offered a chance she never expected. Walking away changed. The kitchen door swung open slowly as she stepped inside. The warmth of the room wrapped around her, filled with the scent of baked bread and simmering sauces. The noise here was different. The clatter of plates, the hiss of boiling pots, the low hum of kitchen chatter. It was a world separate from the chandelier-lit hall she had just left, yet she still carried the weight of that other room in her chest. A few of the other staff members glanced up when they saw her. The young waiter in the corner gave her a knowing look, didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His small nod was enough to let her know he had been watching. It was the kind of nod given by someone who understood exactly what it meant to be underestimated and then prove them wrong. She went to the small counter at the back and picked up a tray of coffee cups waiting to be served. Her hands still tingled faintly. From the piano keys, every movement felt slower now, not from fatigue, but from the strange shift inside her. Something had opened. Something she had thought was locked away forever. She made her way back into the hall. The guests were scattered now, deep in their own conversations, but here and there, eyes still followed her as she passed, not with the distant, dismissive glances she had known before. These were different, softer, thoughtful, curious. Some guests smiled at her as she placed coffee cups on their tables. A few even murmured small thank yous, the kind given not out of habit but with sincerity. She caught sight of the hostess speaking quietly with the silver-haired man in the blue scarf. They were glancing in her direction. She pretended not to notice. Her heart gave a quiet beat of anticipation. She didn't know what would come from tonight, and maybe she wouldn't find out for weeks. But it didn't matter, because the offer, the chance, had been real. And the knowledge of that alone was enough to change something in her when the evening began to wind down. The music from the hired quartet started up again. It was gentle, elegant, filling the spaces between conversations. She moved among the tables with steady steps, but every so often, she caught herself glancing toward the piano. It stood there, untouched. Its surface gleaming under the chandelier, she remembered. The way it had felt under her hands, the weight of the keys, the deep hum of the low notes, the bright ring of the high ones. That sound would stay with her long after she left this place. By the time the last of the guests had departed, the hall was quiet again. The tables were half cleared, the candles burning low. The hostess approached her near the doorway. "You were remarkable tonight," she said simply. The words were not dressed in flattery. They were plain, and therefore carried more weight. The maid only nodded in thanks. Her voice caught somewhere between pride and disbelief. The hostess hesitated, then added, "You should think about those offers you were given." Her tone was calm, but certain. They don't come to just anyone. With that, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The maid stood still for a moment, letting the quiet settle around her. She thought of the business cards tucked into the pocket of her uniform. They were small, but they felt like keys. Keys to doors she had never imagined would open for her. She could throw them away tomorrow, or she could hold on to them. Either choice was hers, and that freedom. That possibility felt new when the last of the cleanup was done. She stepped outside into the cool night. The city air met her with a crispness that cleared her head. The street was quiet, just the distant hum of traffic and the soft glow of street lights. She walked slowly, her bag slung over her shoulder. Her shoes clicked lightly against the pavement, each step echoing in the stillness. She didn't rush. There was no need for the first time in years. She felt as if she wasn't just moving from one shift to the next. She was walking toward something. Even if she didn't yet know what it was, she passed a shop window and caught her reflection, the same uniform, the same face, but her eyes looked different. They held a spark she hadn't seen in a long time. The kind of spark that comes when a forgotten dream suddenly reminds you it's still alive. As she turned down her street, she imagined her small apartment. She imagined sitting by the window, taking out one of those business cards and just thinking, not deciding, not yet, but letting herself believe, even a little, that music could be part of her life again. She knew tomorrow she would put the uniform back on. She would carry trays, polish glasses, wipe down tables, but tomorrow she would do it knowing that she was more than the job, more than the title of maid. She was someone who could silence a room with a single note, someone who still had music in her hands. And as she reached her door and slid the key into the lock, a small smile touched her lips. The night was over, but its echo would stay with her. The offers might lead somewhere, or they might not. Either way, something had shifted. She had walked into that house as the help, and she had walked out carrying the quiet certainty that she was, and always would be, a musician.